Clay, a bloody 4th of July weekend, the leading headline today, 150 people killed, over 400 shootings across the nation, 88 shootings in Chicago alone. Turns out there are more important things for all of us to be thinking about other than the American flag is frightening to some people.
Maybe if we spent more time worried about actual murder rates and less time about systemic racism, we would have less murder in this country. But this is what anyone with a functional brain predicted was going to happen as soon as defund the police took flight over the past year. Basically, since May of last year, our cities have turned into killing fields. And we are, as a group, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, overwhelmingly, people want to fund police, and they are incredibly troubled. I saw in a recent survey, Buck, 20-year high in worries about crime in the United States, nearly a high for the entire 21st century. We are making awful choices as it pertains to safety in this country. And all of those are being led, despite what they're trying to say, Buck, by the Democratic Party.
Also want to make it clear for everyone that you're seeing some of these viral videos of theft, shoplifting in broad daylight. San Francisco, this one just went viral the last 24 hours. That's not a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention to what some of these Marxist district attorneys in major cities like San Fran and Philadelphia. It all adds up, Clay. This is all completely in line with what, as you said, anybody with a functional brain would expect. It's hard to think of a more manifestly idiotic idea than defund the police. I mean, that's crazy. It's as though they're trying to kick at the load-bearing walls of American society for fun, and that's really what they've been doing. But just to get a sense from a Chicago alderman about, this is from somebody who's there, who's seeing this in his, in his district, his ward. It's a slightly different way of saying it in Chicago. This is what he's saying about 4th of July weekend. Play 14.
I think that's pure nonsense. We have the strongest and the strictest gun laws in the state, if not the country. And if you go to our surrounding borders right now, where we're supposedly getting all the guns for, they have nowhere near the amount of crime that we do. We have a people problem here in Chicago. I've been saying this for a long time. We have zero accountability for parents in the city of Chicago. Nobody's raising their kids anymore. The gangs are raising them.
These are the kind of things that you would think we would have a conversation, Clay. You know how the left always forces a national conversation? Isn't it time for one on what's really causing this 20-year high spike in shootings and murders in this country, instead of pretending that it's the police who account for, less than 1/10 of 1% of the shootings we're talking about?
This is what's so dishonest about the way that the last year of coverage has played out. And look, it's not a surprise that in 2016, Michael Brown, hands up, don't shoot. It's a lie, right? A huge percentage of the American population still doesn't know that that's a lie. That's been a lie confirmed by multiple investigations. But in 2016, Black Lives Matter begins its assault upon, I think, frankly, safety in American cities, because the data reflects that the Ferguson effect is real. And as soon as you demonize the police, the crime rate immediately skyrockets. The more you demonize police, the higher the crime rate skyrockets. 2020, we've got another election. We have the George Floyd video that also then sparks the national conversation. And what happens, Buck, is we're on these cycles now where every 4 years the angst, the outrage against police gets ratcheted up, and then over the next several years we start to see, hey, maybe this is a bad idea. Remember back in 2016 we had the police shootings, which despite the fact that some stories never seem to disappear. Remember the Dallas police, the guy who tried to execute basically Dallas police officers in 2016.
He killed 5 of them.
Yeah. And intentionally targeted them because of the idea that they were targeting minorities. And now in 2021, everybody suddenly takes a step back and says, wait a minute, this is out of control. We got twin issues, Buck. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. not only is the murder rate skyrocketing, the violent crime rate skyrocketing, but you also couple that with overwhelming resignations, difficulty in recruiting new police officers, because why in the world would you want to be a police officer right now based on the way they're being treated all over this country? So you've got not only defunding police, but a serious lack of police able to do their jobs. And as a result, we've got killing fields all over the country. And ironically enough, who are the primary victims out there? Young, innocent victims that are doing nothing wrong. They are minorities. Black Lives Matter claims to care about black lives, but really what they care about is Black Lives Mattering when there is a white police officer involved. Otherwise, it doesn't really register. These are the realities on our streets right now in our cities and all over the country.
We know that the paradigm is shifting because Democrats are changing their positions on this. And in fact, they're trying to change history, Soviet style. They're rewriting it in real time. You could go and see it at The Guardian, a British paper. Sometimes the British papers actually have more honest stuff about things in America because they're not part of our left-wing corporate media. But The Guardian, which is a very left-wing paper, had all the different cities that they said were in some stage, and this was from just March of 2021 this year. So less than a year into it, all the cities that had at some level either defunded or started to defund, because it has to do with the budget process, police: New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and about a dozen other cities with substantially reduced police spending. In the case of New York, they talked about $1 billion cut from the police budget. In Austin, Texas, it was $80 million moved over out of law enforcement to other things into a general fund. This was all entirely, as we've said, predictable. But now we're being told, and this is the part that I think is really hard for people. It's hard for me, Clay, to sit there and hear this stuff. Now we're being told the Democrats are actually the pro-police party. They're the ones that actually want to make sure they have the funding they need, and they back the blue. Now, I want to get into why this is a lie, because it's a lie in terms of fact and in terms of narrative. But let's just first deal with what Press Secretary Jen Psaki is saying now. I mean, she's at the White House. She realizes crime is like a top 5, sometimes top 3 issue nationwide in polling for concerns right now this country has. Here's what the press secretary is saying. Play 3.
The president ran on, most importantly, did not run on defunding the police. He's always opposed defunding the police. I'll also note, because you've asked this question before or a few times over the last several days, that when we talk about individuals in Congress and their support for funding or opposition to funding for the police, I think what the American people are most focused on is how people vote, what their record is, which is a public record. And I will note that while the president ran on and won the most votes of any candidate in history on a platform of boosting funding for law enforcement after Republicans spent decades trying to cut the COPS program, which again is public record. We don't need to undervalue the intelligence of the American people. The president ran on increasing that funding. It's in his budget. In President Trump's budget, he significantly cut that. So that's a change.
Now, let's just look at the factual reality here. The president now, when he was the candidate in June of 2020, gave a speech in which he said that they needed real police reform, a down payment on what is long overdue. He was calling on Congress to direct measures such as outlawing chokeholds, stop transferring weapons of war. These are his actual words from that speech. Improve oversight and accountability. I mean, Clay, he was playing into you mentioned the Ferguson effect. Biden was playing right into it just from another perspective, right? It's okay, I'm not going to go after their budgets, but I'm going to go after their tactics and procedures to effectively neutralize law enforcement's ability to do their jobs.
No doubt, Buck. And I want to go back. Remember we talked when we discussed how they were starting to pivot on the overall issues associated with defund the police. And I talked about the New York Times trying to pivot here. I just want to read this quote because, again, this to me is the essence of what we're talking about. Some people can get wrapped up in the politics of this. I would get wrapped up in the reality of what's happening on the streets and how dishonest our media is being. This is Sandra Samuels, quoted in the New York Times. For the last year, I and my neighbors have watched black mothers react with incredulity when their child is killed in community violence and not by a white cop. This is a black mother. Their tragedies do not trigger citywide protest rallies. People don't say their child's name, and there are no citywide demands. This has to stop. This is in response to a 9-year-old girl, Trinity Otteson Smith, who was killed by a stray bullet while jumping on a trampoline in Minneapolis. This is the real, tangible impact of defund the police, Buck. It is leading directly to far more deaths, more murders, more violent crime, particularly in inner city neighborhoods. And I just think the irony here, which doesn't get talked about hardly by anybody in media because they're afraid, I think, of being called racist, is Black Lives Matter is protesting police, which is directly leading to more black lives being lost to violent crime. And almost no one is willing to make that connection. It is a huge tragedy right now. And the political element here is Democrats want to run away from defund the police, Buck. And simultaneously, if you point out issues like these, what do they say, Buck? Oh,
racist.
You're racist for even bringing this up. Look, I think everybody out there wants there to be less murders. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic. This is not a race-related issue at all in any measure.
It's amazing, isn't it, that you can talk earnestly and seriously about how to make everyone safer, which would disproportionately, in the context of law enforcement, save the lives of black and brown people living in major cities in America. Disproportionately save, would save all of us, but disproportionately save them. And as you point out, that's called racist. And I also want to say there are numerous, this is always a tell for Democrats, and we'll get into this in just a minute. There are numerous narratives that are, on the one hand, it's, oh, we're actually the pro-police party, the Democrats are saying. On the other, they're also telling us, what are you talking about? There's not a big rise in violent crime.
We need Lightfoot audio, which is just going to... Poor Chicago res. I know there's lots... We've talked about this, Buck. There's lots of bad mayors in America right now. Lori Lightfoot is up there, right?
Top three.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm very partial to Bill de Blasio as the worst in New York City. But we'll get into what Lori Lightfoot's saying in Chicago. We played the Chicago alderman saying it's a war zone. Lori Lightfoot has a different take. That'll come up in just a... You got to hear it to believe it. That'll come up in just a second.
Welcome back in. Clay Travis, Buck Sexton Show. We are rolling through the Tuesday edition of the program. I hope your week is off to a good start. Want you to know, by the way, we had a show yesterday. I thought it was pretty fantastic. You can go download the podcast, search out Clay Travis, search out Buck. I have noticed tons of you giving us 5-star reviews. We're going to put Dub on our staff here to work reviewing some of those. If you make us laugh, if you say something funny in the 5-star review, blow us away with your wit. We will read some of those at some point this week. We also want to catch NPR. We are fast on their heels. And fingers crossed that we are going to be able to do it. Buck Sexton, I know, right?
Well, what is this? This cereal now is number 4 and we are number 5?
Oh, no.
A starchy breakfast food is ahead of us? Unacceptable.
We are still top 5, but yes, the cereal podcast. I don't even know what cereal version they're on. Not the cereal like Lucky Charms, but they're like a true crime
like serial
podcast.
Killer, right?
Why do they even count as a news story? Like, is that really news that you would be kind of chasing like a serial killer from 50 years ago?
I'm throwing a flag on it. I'll tell you right now.
I think it's a little bit unfair, but I want you guys to go subscribe, keep us rolling. I still want to catch NPR up first, by the way, and also the New York Times Daily. At some point, we are going to manage to do it because you are the biggest and best radio audience anywhere in the country. So if you search out my name, Buck Sexton, go give us 5 stars, and please go subscribe to the podcast. Now, we are talking about the cities of America becoming killing fields, the likes of which we have not seen in the 21st century. Doesn't matter where you live. The numbers are skyrocketing everywhere in the wake of the Defund the Police protest. And some of the mayors out there are being dishonest about exactly what is going on, including the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot. Buck is going to hit you with the data on what happened in Chicago over the weekend. Unfortunately, this awful crime wave that is continuing. But the mayors themselves are lying very often to their constituents. Here is Lori Lightfoot, play 25.
Once again, sir, I ask you to get your facts right. Crime is not out of control in our city. In fact, crime is on the decline. All of our major indices show that the decline in crime and our homicides and our shootings year over year are down. That's a fact, sir. And you, sir, I was polite and allowed you to spew your rhetoric, which is offensive to me and others, but I'm trying to be polite and professional and answer your question. But if you want to write your own narrative and irrelevant to what I'm going to say and what the facts are, then we'll just move on to the next reporter.
Buck, what are the actual? So that's Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, saying, "How dare you raise issues with crime?" Buck, what are the numbers coming out of July 4th weekend that we just passed in Chicago?
Well, there was a headline on Fox that was 88. It's actually 92. I'm seeing updated here at the New York Post. 92 people shot over the weekend, 16 of whom died. So we'll come back with more of this data on exactly what's going on in just a second. Welcome back to the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton Show. I'm Buck here with Clay. We are breaking down the latest numbers when it comes to violent shootings. The results of defund the police, let's all be very clear, that is what we are seeing in cities nationwide. If you're fortunate and don't live in a city, you're not experiencing this stuff. But whatever state you're in, I can assure you that if you've got a city with 500,000 people or more in your state, you've got violence on the rise in a big way over the last year, and shootings and homicides. And that brings us then to Chicago, which gets a lot of attention because of its very high per capita murder rate for a U.S. city. And it's the third largest city in America. It's a great American city. And yet it's having these terrible crime problems. We had just before the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot. Remember her also during the pandemic? She got a haircut when no one else got a haircut, and it was because she was public-facing, Clay. Basically, yeah, of course I get a haircut during the pandemic. I'm important, not like you serfs, you plebs.
Not only that, Buck, she's refused to do one-on-one interviews with white people. And so you have to be a person of color in order to actually be able to interview Lori Lightfoot. And remember, she went out in the streets and celebrated when Joe Biden won the election without a mask on, got a megaphone, was yelling to everybody, and then she was lecturing everybody in Chicago about the necessity of them actually having, their masks on. She got caught so many different times. I mean, she is a hypocrite of the first magnitude. And this clip, I mean, is just indicative of what debate has become for Democratic Party stalwarts.
I just want to be very clear that I think the mayor would put you in the 99%, Clay. The 99% of her critics who are racist and sexist. This is a flashback. Before we play it for you, though, this was in response to a question from a local news host on Chicago Tonight. He said to Mayor Lori Lightfoot, quote, "Mayor, in recent months, there have been questions raised about your temperament and your reaction to criticism. A Tribune editorial used the term irascible. How much of this do you think might have to do with the fact that you're a woman, specifically a black woman?" Quite a leading question. Here's how she responded.
About 99% of it.
Expand on that.
Well, I mean, look at my predecessors. Did people say that Rich Daley held, tea sessions with people that he didn't disagree on? Rahm Emanuel was a polite guy who was a uniter? No. Women and people of color are always held to a different standard. I understand that. I've known that my whole life. And the Tribune or whoever can write what they want.
If you'll play the racism and the sexism card as the mayor of a city where there was widespread organized looting during the pandemic lockdowns, remember those videos of cars driving into plate glass windows and them stealing everything and having week after week violence numbers that just are just shocking to everyone else in America. Clay, I think you'll play, if someone will play the cards in those circumstances, they'll play them under any circumstances.
Look, when you are a public figure, and look, this is where we are headed with Kamala Harris, right? She hasn't said it explicitly yet, but last week we talked about all of the criticism she was getting as vice president, and we are close to that argument being, remember we had that idiot Joy Behar come out and say, oh, this is why they attack Kamala Harris, because Joe Biden is a white guy, and nobody ever says anything negative about Joe Biden. And I'm sitting around thinking, Joy Behar is being paid millions of dollars on The View to have no clue what anyone ever says. To be fair or foul, Joe Biden gets 90% at least, maybe 95% of all criticism because he is the president of the United States. The vice president gets less. When you are the sitting mayor and you have a massive, out-of-control crime rate, you get ripped to the high heavens. And look, she's trying, Lori Lightfoot is, to put the blame on racism and sexism, but she mentioned Rahm Emanuel. Buck, I remember Rahm Emanuel getting destroyed by people over the Chicago crime rate. Nothing to do with the fact that he was a man.
But wouldn't it just be better if we could expect that people who, remember, the mayor of a city like Chicago, the police department reports to the mayor, right?
Yes.
I worked for the NYPD intelligence division. I actually then worked really for Mayor Bloomberg. Yes, the police commissioner in a more direct role, but I work for Mayor Bloomberg. If you work in a large metropolitan police department, the actually the Secretary of Defense, not even the 4-star general, the Secretary of Defense equivalent of that, police army, so to speak, is the mayor. And you would think that instead of playing all these games and the data, the numbers, oh, they're sexist, they're racist, you could focus in on, here's what we're going to do to make things better. But instead, because remember, all of these mayors, and you know this, I know this, everyone has to remember this, all these mayors were out marching with, and I mean actually literally marching with Black Lives Matter. They were out there a year ago, this month, in June and July 2020, de Blasio, Lightfoot, that idiot who runs Portland, whose name escapes me right.
Ted Wheeler.
There we go, Wheeler. All of them were out there holding hands with people saying, we shall overcome the police brutality and violence. And then they allowed, in many of these cities, police to be defunded. It was so catastrophic that now Democrats are pretending they didn't do that. And here's what I want to say, Clay, because I don't want to let this go, about Biden's pivot on this, about, he's Mr. Fund the police. He's, oh, yeah, I'm all about the cops. Sure, no joke. If Biden really believed that, if he was reasonable and recognized what's really going on here, why not call on his fellow Democrats who clearly were saying defund the police, who were saying abolish the police in some context? Why not say that's not what we as Democrats are about? That's going to result in more people being shot and killed. You can't have it both ways, Biden.
And that's exactly right, Buck. And if you think about the politics of police, remember that it was Bill Clinton who initially, with Joe Biden's help, passed this tough on crime bill and put, I think it was like 100,000 more cops on the streets. And to their credit back then, this is how much the Democrat Party has moved, Buck Sexton. They used to be, back in the 90s, when Joe Biden, who's been there 47 years, Joe Biden, to be fair, has been on every side of every issue because he's been in Washington for so long. He can talk about that perspective. But if you actually go back and look at it, this wasn't even remotely a radical idea. Everybody, Democrats and Republicans, understood, because the data is transparent and clear and facts matter, that if you have more police, crime goes down. And if you have fewer police, crime goes up. This is such an idiotic argument. I think it's the dumbest argument that any political party has made in the 21st century, which is saying something because there's been a lot of dumb ones. Defund the police is literally the dumbest argument of the 21st century, and we are seeing the tangible results, which anyone, as I said earlier, with a functional brain, Buck Sexton, could have predicted.
Walls don't work for me is maybe a close second, but that's defund the police.
Walls don't work. Being said by people who live inside of gated communities is always amazing, and sometimes in the always elusive double gate, right? You ever been to some of those houses, Buck, where you drive into a gate, and then inside of the gated community, the houses also have gates?
Well, that then brings me to another absolutely critical takeaway from all this craziness that we've been seeing from the left. I mean, from the Marxist, insane left on these issues of police and, dealing with police violence and acting like that's really the threat that predominantly minority urban communities are dealing with. It's bad. It's law enforcement that's causing all this stuff. when you see all this come together, you see the trajectory that's been happening over the last year, you also have to recognize that it is overwhelmingly, and the data supports this, but also anecdotally, you know this is true, well-off white liberals. It's Bernie
so
voters
yes.
who live in Santa Monica and whatever the fancy part of Chicago is, I don't know off the top of my head, and live in, Park Slope and Brooklyn Heights and the Upper West Side. They're the ones who have still ample police presence, who have private security for their neighborhoods often, who have low crime in their areas. They think that they're the ones who care about minorities by making it more difficult for the 99.9% of minority Americans living in these communities to go about their lives in peace without the possibility of, bullets flying over their car at any point in time. That's the reality.